We're continuing the series in Daniel that Simon started 2 weeks ago, called Breathing Deeply in Babylon. I've been exploring the idea that in a place like Babylon or like London is now, where the city is decidedly anti-God, how do we breathe in God's life and breathe out his life to others in a place where everything seems to be against us? We kind of got halfway through chapter 2 last week. Daniel engaged with the scary situation that was presented in front of him. There was a threat to his life and the life of all the other wise men in Babylon. And Daniel sticks his hand up and says, "I'll interpret your dream." Before he's had the interpretation from God, before he's got a chance to go to God and say, "Will you give me the interpretation?" hand goes up, "I'll interpret your dream," because he knows what God is like. He knows that God wants to glorify himself in that foreign land. So we're going to get stuck into chapter 3 today. We'll touch the end of chapter 2 and launch into chapter 3. And as we go, we'll break off a few times just to kind of dig in a little bit, set the scene, really learn kind of what's going on. And then we'll explore how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these Hebrew young men, who probably were about 18 years old, younger than most of us in here, how they made their decision to do the crazy thing that they did, which actually was crazier than Daniel sticking his hand up, but we'll get to that. So we left off with Daniel having rolled the dice. He'd engaged with the situation, he'd prayed, and then he rolled the dice. He just put it in God's hands. God came through for him, and the king promoted him to a high position in the government. And at Daniel's request, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got promoted too. Can we have the... Yeah, so this is the end of chapter 2. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel. First things first. What king falls on his face in front of someone else, in front of probably some other people who saw him do it, and pays homage to another guy? Especially a king like Nebuchadnezzar, who's like got pride issues up to here, which Simon will talk about next week. He commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to Daniel. Interesting. The king answered, said to Daniel, "Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over the wise men of Babylon. He only arrived a few months ago, maybe a couple of years ago, and suddenly he's the boss of all the wise men that have been training him. Daniel made a request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. Now, if you notice, they're both in Babylon, in the province of Babylon. So the boys have got to stick together. That will come in helpful later on. But what's interesting from the story that we're coming up to is that Daniel is just the commentator. Daniel's not in the thick of the action. Now, we can't get hung up on the fact that Daniel isn't in the thick of the action. We don't know why he wasn't. We can't just surmise a whole bunch of things. But he's the commentator, and his 3 friends, who he's kind of been the leader of, now get to show kind of what they're made of without their leader around. You know, what would we be like if Simon went on holiday for 6 months? Keep it quiet. But this story, like, the context is the leader's off to one side, and now you've got these 3 guys who have each other, but they're not the leaders. Now, they are leaders in their own way. They're royal they're young royal Hebrews, and they're leaders in their own society, but they're in another place, and the person they've looked to, the person who's got them promoted, is now no longer right in front of them. Before we launch into this, Nebuchadnezzar is a worshipper of many gods. Babylon had many gods. One of them was called Nebu, and he or she was the god of fire and of various kind of arts. So we're launching into this thing about the fiery furnace. Bear in mind that one of the gods they worship is about fire and music. Okay, so King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. That's half the height of the Albert Memorial out there, 27 meters tall. That's a big statue, whatever it is. See, I thought that was a statue of himself. Now, he does have a pride issue, But the likelihood is this isn't a statue of Nebuchadnezzar. They're not expected to bow down and worship him. It's probably a statue of the god Nebu. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon, visible from miles around. The king Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the councillors, the treasurers, the justice, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces. That's the 7 levels of his government. And all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. This was a glorious day. He's about to unveil his golden image. Weird thing with Nebuchadnezzar. He just got a dream interpreted in the last chapter. I don't know if you went and read the dream after last week's sermon. But the dream's pretty much all negative for Nebuchadnezzar. And he seizes on the one point that's positive. And that's that, like, he's going to be the golden head. The rest of the fact that the whole statue gets destroyed by God later is like, he just seems to forget. You know, he's praised Daniel for interpreting his dream. Oh, I'm the golden head. Daniel's like, yeah, but I said you were going to get taken down. Anyway, so Nebuchadnezzar's kind of a bit self-focused. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the councillors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered. So everyone came. They didn't reject the invitation. They stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Next slide. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as the peoples heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, what do? They fell down and worshipped. Most people would. No one wants to die in a fiery furnace. And this is why that situation is more dangerous for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego than it was for Daniel the week before, or the couple of months before. Because Daniel was going to die anyway if he didn't interpret the dream. These guys, if they bow down and worship, they get off scot-free, seemingly. I can't remember what movie it is. It may even just be a comedy show that I watch. But you imagine this scene, every time you hear music, you've got to bow down and worship this thing. You better hope there's no radio playing or something like that, like, because no one will get any work done. It's just insane. But here comes that music and fire thing. You know, if the music, when you hear music, if you don't bow down and worship Nebu, then you get cast into the fiery furnace. This was about another god. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had a practical and a theological decision to make. Nebuchadnezzar had said, bow down and worship Nebu when you hear music. God says in Exodus 20, verse 3 and 4, you might have to skip a slide or two, that you shall have no other gods but me, first commandment of the 10 commandments. Second one, which they would have known very, very well, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that's in heaven above, or anything that's in the earth beneath, or anything that is under the water or under the earth. Combine the two, don't bow down and worship this golden statue. That goes against God's commandments. So theologically, it was quite obvious. They had a choice between the two. Practically, they were either going to die, or they were going to disobey God, which would have been life without God. No, so it may seem like an obvious decision, but with the threat of death, right there and then, becomes a bit more difficult. They can't please both of them. The question is, so they have to choose. The question is, who is their king? Who ultimately is their king? So let's have a quick discussion. Turn to the person next to you. Quickly tell them whose opinion matters most to you. Like the top 5 people. If you can place the top 3 in order, that would be great. I'll give you 2 minutes. We don't need music. 2 minutes. Whose opinion matters most to you? Okay. Okay, so who's on the list?
You are.
You have to shout out. Can't hear you from here. Who's on the list? Who's on your list? You know that I want you to take God first, but who else is on the list?
Jesus.
So we hear God. We've heard
Jesus, Holy Spirit.
family, spouse,
Cousins.
mum and dad.
Simons. Peers.
There's a big one. I think most of us wish that peers were a lot lower on the list, but they tend to creep up. It's like bubbles in a fizzy drink, right to the top. Okay, so we're faced. Park that thought for a second. They've been faced with a situation. Now, what do? Verse 13. So the one after that one. Next one. So they get grassed up, basically. Some of the locals say, these Jews, King Nebuchadnezzar, they're not bowing down and worshipping your statue. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? So he goes off into a furious rage. Now, it's not surprising. He is quite an emotional guy. He's one way, he's the next. He's just all over the place. So he flies off in this furious rage, commands that they be brought to him. So they're brought to him. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I've set up?" There's an indication that it's kind of about the gods. Now, if you're ready when you hear the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I've made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall be immediately cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who's the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Now, I put the emphasis on there, but isn't he taunting God? Isn't he just like making a mockery of the God who just interpreted his dream? That he was just bowing down and worshipping Daniel for. Your God is the God of all gods, the King of all kings, the revealer of mysteries. And who's this God who's going to deliver you out of my hands? Suddenly he's become God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, now they don't even say king. Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. And that's ballsy. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, Be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. Now they've put him in a rage. He was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These were people who served in his government. He just promoted them. He ordered that the furnace be heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. Now, 7 is a number in the Bible that speaks of completeness. It may not actually have been 7 times the degrees Celsius. Don't get too hung up on it. It was stupid hot. And he ordered some of the men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Now, who's ever made a fire that they couldn't get near? Come on, there've got to be boys in here that made a fire like that. We were on a scout camp. I must have been about 12 years old. And we had these enormous tents, and we built this fire a little bit too close to the tent. We had to move the tent because the fire was too hot. Now, it wasn't like one of these little tent. It was like a 8-foot tall, 10-foot long, big canvas tent that took like half an hour to put up, and we were scrambling to take this thing down because you couldn't get within 5 feet of this fire without kind of getting stuff singed, and you couldn't get within 10 feet and stand there for more than a minute without like completely like passing out or something crazy. So we weren't trying it. We were just trying to get away from this fire. On the way home from another camp that we went on, we drove through a bushfire. Now, you don't have a lot of bushfires in England. It's not usually hot enough and dry enough, as the recent weather has shown. But there was a bushfire, and it jumped across the road into the central reservation. So we were driving down this road, and it hadn't been closed. It was closed 10 minutes afterwards, and there's fire both sides. Now, we're in a car with the windows up, and we could feel this fire. Like, put your hands on the rubber seals on the car window. Woo, that's hot. Put your foot down. We need to get out of here. Hot fire. And this was a furnace. So they made bricks in it, or they melted metals and did all that metal work in it. And this is hotter than it usually is. So, next slide. They were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and other garments, which were all flammable, and they were thrown in the burning fiery furnace, with their hands tied, and possibly their feet tied as well. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed the men who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up to the furnace. This fire was stinking hot. The 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the fiery furnace. They're not doing any Houdini act, they're not getting out of there. If you notice, the other guys died before they got to the furnace. So God's actually with them before they get in the furnace, because otherwise they'd have died too. King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 bound men into the furnace?" They answered and said to him, "Yes, that's true." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking around in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." This is a crazy story. God has shown up in the midst of their trial. Now, different people say that that's an angel or that's Jesus. What we have to know is God is there with them. God delivers them from the fire before they even fall in. And when they're in there, he's with them in there. And they're walking around. They're just chilling out. Next slide. So Nebuchadnezzar came to the door of the furnace and basically called them out. The hair on their heads wasn't singed, their cloaks weren't harmed, and there was no smell of fire on them. Who's been to a barbecue and come home not smelling of fire? No one. They were able to walk through the fire and it didn't touch them at all. That's what God does in a fire for us. So Nebuchadnezzar has his mood swing again. "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God." He's flipped again. What is with this guy? You see, we have to make a choice of which king we're going to serve. Do we serve the erratic human rulers of that age or this, who change their minds depending on how they feel, whose view of God, Nebuchadnezzar, it's startlingly obvious with him. Maybe it's not quite so obvious with our bosses and people like that, but his view of God is completely determined by what he can get from God. Completely. Whether it's the God of Israel or his gods or whatever, it's all about Nebuchadnezzar. He's forever changing. The God of the Bible, God of Israel, on the other hand, says in 1 Samuel 15:29, God is not man that he should lie or change his mind. Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today and forever. God is the creator, the owner of all things. He's eternal, he's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, he's loving, he's just. He leads his people personally, he's aware of and he's concerned with the minutiae of his creation, including our every need, desire and thought, good and bad. Now, long ago, people had realized that they'd wronged God and they needed some way to get right with him. Nowadays, we have a tendency to think, okay, God, prove yourself to me. God's in the dock, we're the judge. Slight role reversal there. And we put him in our place on the stand. The confrontational, absolute truth is that God is God and that we're not. So when we realize that, some other things can fall into place. Can we have that slide with the colours on it? We've got to keep it startlingly simple. I'm not going to call you stupid, so I'll change the S's. So we've got to keep it startlingly simple. If we're going to be able to live in a city that's anti-God, we've got to keep it simple as to how we're going to live our lives. The first one, the K. Know your God. Know who God is. God is God. He's not some like genie in a bottle that when we want a new laptop or we need food or something like that, we pray and God, please give me a food, give me a laptop, and it turns up on our doorstep. If that was the case, if we were in control of God like that, we'd be God. God is God. We are his creation. We have to know who God is. See, they knew that God was the God who saved. They'd been brought, their people had been brought out of Egypt. They'd been saved a few weeks or months or a couple of years before when Daniel interpreted the dream. They knew that God saved. Do we know God saves? And not just in the sense that he saved us once, but will he save us when we get into a sticky situation? Is he there with us? See, that they knew when they got cast into the fire that God was going to do something. And they also said, if you notice, that if God didn't do anything, that was his prerogative. How difficult is it for us to accept that? If God doesn't do something for me, I'm going to reconsider my position on God. How often do we think like that? You know, we can get into situations where God doesn't react how we think he should. Brittany should have been healed years ago. Why haven't you done this, God? We've been praying for ages. Why hasn't it happened? God's God. I'm not God. He knows what he's doing. He's trying us through the fire, and he's going to bring something out gold. The next one, I had to stretch that a little bit. Know your identity. Again, this is kind of a flip side of the same coin. We have to know who we are if we're going to be able to kind of take the next step. We are God's creation. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew they were God's servants. They were in a place which wasn't set up to kind of take them to church every Sunday, that wasn't set up to kind of encourage them in their faith. And yet they knew deep down that they were Hebrews. They knew that they were Hebrews. It was just who they were. And Hebrews worshipped God, or so they should. And so when it came down to, do I worship God or worship Nebu, it's a no-brainer. Now they were daring, because it was their lives at stake. But at the end of the day, it came down to knowing their identity. God created us in his image. Very soon after, he gives instruction. Go and multiply, fill the earth, have dominion over these things. Next book of the Bible, out come the 10 Commandments. God is in charge. He gives the commandments. We're his servants. King Nebuchadnezzar had no idea about this. You know, he was in charge when he felt like he was in charge, and which was all the time, and the gods were there to serve him. Ultimately, we must know that our identity is based in who God's made us to be. As a father, God the Father, he cares for us, he corrects us, he disciplines us, he delights in us, he loves us. He sent Jesus to save us from our sins. If we accept this glorious truth and its ramifications, we become God's children. That's our identity. The S, we must stand. They knew who they were, they knew who God was, but they still had to make the stand. I don't know how they could have got around it, but they could have fudged some things along the way, possibly. But they stood, and they got noticed for it. Now, if everyone else bows down when the music starts and you're standing up, it's kind of obvious that you didn't bow down. It's quite a daring stand. It's not like they just kind of were able to not be there. But how about us here? You know, we live in a city which tends to turn up the heat on us quite a lot. It's kind of difficult to get a job here. So what happens when you have a job and your boss asks you to do something that goes against what God's called you to do? What if you know you're going to get fired if you don't do what they say? What if they ask you to leave some transactions off the books, to fudge the accounts? You don't know why they want it to be done. Maybe you do. Maybe that's even worse. But do you do it? Or do you quit? Would you say, I'm happy to be an accountant here, but I'm not doing that? That's not right, and this is why it's not right. If you work in a place where health and safety is important, and you don't have time to do the health and safety check before you open the building up, and your boss says, just sign the form, it'll be fine. Do you sign the form? Or do you open late? You don't work in an area of health and safety, clearly. It's not worth opening on time if you're putting your reputation, your integrity on the line. It's just not. What if your lecturer emails you the exam paper instead of emailing it to his secretary who's supposed to print it off for the exam tomorrow? Do you reply and say, I don't think you meant to send this to me? Or do you remember every single question that's on there, go away, study, and do the exam and pass it? What if they send it to everybody? What if they send it to the whole class? Do you dare to reply and face the wrath of your classmates? Do you do the right thing? It's difficult, isn't it? It seems like these decisions, the decision they made seems so obvious. And yet when it comes down to the decisions that we face, it's not quite so clear. There's a professor, it was one of my favourite stories about a student standing up for his faith. It's from Harvard University in the 1800s. There's a professor called Simon Greenleaf who'd written a treatise on evidence. He was a law professor, one of the founders of the Harvard Law School, famous the world over. And he wrote this book on how to treat evidence and how to assess evidence in a court of law. And he releases this book, I think it's in 1846 or something, between 1844 and 1846. And when he's published this book, it's obviously gone down to great acclaim. And one of his Christian students, this guy's an agnostic, which, given it was 1800s, the equivalent of being an atheist now. One of his Christian students says to him, I dare you to apply your treatise of evidence to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So he goes, he thinks, well, that's a worthwhile challenge. So he goes away and he applies his theories to the resurrection. He comes back a year later. He writes an essay called The Testimony of the Evangelists. Well worth reading. Old English, but well worth reading. He'd come to the conclusion that the evidence proved that the resurrection happened. much more so than any of the other ancient texts that they accepted as just fact, or just accepted as being from the people that are supposed to have written them. The evidence held up. But he became a Christian because some student in his class dared to stand up and say, apply that to the resurrection. See where that goes. There's a movie coming out this year called God's Not Dead. I don't know if anyone's seen the trailer. But it's a similar kind of principle. The professor says to his students, in order to pass this class, you have to sign a statement that says, God is dead. And a Christian student says, I'm not signing that statement. I need to pass the class to get this degree, but I'm not signing that statement. What can we do about that? And so there's going to be a whole load of debates between the professor and the student. And he's put up in front of his class for ridicule, basically. But he refuses to sign that statement. Could we do that? The last S is surrender. We have to surrender ourselves to the will of God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that the fiery furnace awaited. When they stood up, they knew it awaited. They knew that God was with them, but they didn't know what God was going to do. They surrendered themselves to God's plan. They had to trust that God would do the right thing. They had to trust that God was faithful. They had to trust that God was good. They had to trust that God was God, and that even if he didn't save them, that there was a greater purpose in that. We have to do the same. Jesus says in Matthew 16, 24 and 25, Jesus says to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Whoever surrenders to Jesus loses his life, but will find it in Jesus. What fires are blazing around you? Where are the things where you're under pressure between making a decision for God and for something else? We face them all the time. Will you trust God with your life, like these guys did? Maybe it's your reputation. Maybe it's the level of degree you get. Will you trust God with those things? So let's go back to that last slide. Keep it really simple. Know your God. Know your identity. Stand together. And mention the together. Get some people around you who you trust, who will stand with you when the fire comes. It might be on your course you need to find someone who's a Christian who will stand with you when things get a little bit tough on your course. It might be at work, it might be in your family, it could be anywhere. If you don't have people in those situations, find someone from outside to know that you can tell the situation to, you can share it with, who can be there with you. Stand together and surrender. You won't go through the fire without getting burnt unless you surrender to Jesus. There's simply no way. Let's take a minute in silence to think about these things, and then we'll turn to the person next to you. And if you don't kind of want to share exactly what the deepest fire is, then say what the thing you learnt most from today is. Then we're going to get the band up and pray for each other, and we'll get the band up and we'll sing, "Blessed be your name." Because God's worthy of our praise, whether in the fire or not. God's worthy of our praise, whether he's made a decision that seems good to us or doesn't. God is simply worthy of praise, and we simply must surrender.